Good afternoon. Welcome to today's Autism Learning Partnership webinar. We will be talking about ABA and its everyday uses. My name is Sherry Gallant, and I'm part of the Autism Learning Partnership team, and I will be moderating today's session. The Autism Learning Partnership is a branch of the Department of Education and Early Childhood in New Brunswick, Canada. We are the sole provider of the provincial autism training curriculum for preschool autism agencies and educational personnel in the province. We provide bilingual, evidence-based, high-quality professional learning and resources to support families, preschool agencies, and educational personnel. We are also mandated to establish partnerships with organizations nationally and internationally. During this one-hour webinar, you will learn about the science of applied behavioral analysis and as it relates to learning, how ABA applies to everyday life, some common misconceptions about ABA-based interventions, and how ABA can be used to create meaningful learning opportunities for students with autism spectrum disorders and other diverse needs. Our presenter today is Catherine Bro. She is a teacher and board-certified behavior analyst and holds bachelor's degrees in psychology and education. She also holds a master's degree in educational foundation for exceptional learners and a graduate academic certificate in applied behavioral analysis. Catherine has been working in New Brunswick schools for over 20 years, first as a teacher and then as an education support teacher for Resource, and then in a variety of district-based positions where she provided consultation and support to teachers and learning and school-based learning teams to help meet the needs of learners with autism spectrum disorder and other exceptionalities. We welcome your questions today in the webinar. However, Catherine will be answering them at the end. Please use the chat box to type any questions or comments, and I will keep track of those and we can answer them at the end of the hour. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll pass it over to you, Catherine.
Thanks, Sherry. I'm happy to be here today. Sorry, my video didn't start. There we go. Thanks, Sherry. I'm happy to be here today to share information about the science of applied behavior analysis. I first became interested in applied behavior analysis, or ABA, because I thought it could help me in my work with schools. As I learned more about it, I really came to love the science because it has so much potential for solving a wide variety of human and social problems. To get started today, I want to tell you a brief story, I guess. So this is the story of a family I met a few years ago who moved from one province in Canada to another because they wanted to access ABA-based intervention for their son who was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. When they got the diagnosis, they looked at what was available in their province and they researched all of the potential intervention that was available. They decided that ABA offered the greatest potential for their child, so they moved to a province where the intervention was readily available. Moving from one province to another is pretty significant. And although Dad was able to continue to work for the same company, the move meant that he had to take a demotion and a salary reduction. It also meant that the family was further away from the support of their family and friends back home. Now, when I met this family, they'd been living in their new province for almost a year. And one of the things that they expressed really strongly was that they were really pleased with the gains their son had made since he started his ABA program. The gains were in things like the ability to play independently. He was able to interact with his younger brother. And in general, life was easier for the family because things like eating and bathing and community outings had become so much easier for them. Now, I recognize that not everyone has the same resources that was available to this family, but I do think that the story shows the potential of ABA and how it can be used to solve some everyday problems. So if you work with individuals with autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, you've probably heard of ABA. And that's because ABA is considered the most effective evidence-based intervention for autism. Evidence-based simply means that there are numerous scientific studies that have shown the techniques to be effective. In the case of ABA and autism, there are thousands of studies that have shown positive outcomes in areas of social skills, language and communication, self-care and daily living, play, and managing one's own behavior. ABA provides teaching tools to help individuals with ASD gain some meaningful skills. But ABA doesn't apply just to autism. It applies to everyone and across a variety of fields. In fact, you may even use ABA-based techniques in your work and not realize that they come from the science of applied behavior analysis. ABA is the science of human learning. And what that means is that it studies all of the skills and behaviors we learn from birth onward. ABA is based on the principles of learning. And essentially, these principles describe the ways behavior is learned and how it changes over time. In ABA, something to keep in mind is that the term behavior actually refers to anything a person does. And it includes obvious physical actions like walking, subtler actions like reading, talking, and looking, and even private events that cannot be observed, such as thinking, imagining, and feeling. Now, we've all learned millions of behaviors since birth. I want to look at walking as an example of a skill that most people learn. Each person learns to walk in their own time, and that's because of a lot of environmental variables that come into play during the learning process. These variables can include things like motivation, opportunities to practice, available supports, and what happens after attempts at walking have occurred. There's no doubt that any one of these variables can help or hinder the process. What ABA can do, though, is it can look at these variables and others and then use them to improve the outcome for the individual who's learning to walk for the first time, or for the individual who's relearning to walk after an illness or injury. Now, we could analyze all the behaviors people learn with an ABA lens, but the true emphasis of ABA is improvement of socially significant behavior to a meaningful degree. Socially important behavior is anything that improves an individual's quality of life. And when we say improve it to a meaningful degree, we mean that it has to make a difference in their life. If you think of all the needs of individuals with autism spectrum disorder, for example, we can teach needed skills in the areas of communication and language, social interaction, daily living, and so on. I think we'd all agree that acquiring skills in these areas is sure to improve the quality of life for these individuals. But what differentiates ABA from non-ABA intervention is effectiveness. ABA interventions must do two things. First, they must apply the principles of learning, and they must measure results. Now, I'm going to talk about the principles of learning later in the presentation. For now, it's important to know that when I'm talking about measuring results, I mean that we measure the behavior before intervention and after, and compare to determine if there has been a change. A simple example is that of an individual who can say 5 words before intervention and 25 words after. This intervention would be considered a success because the number of spoken words increased, as was the goal. Now, sometimes intervention may not be as successful, meaning behavior doesn't change as expected. This does not mean that ABA is not working, but it does mean that we need to make changes to the intervention to better meet the learner's needs and to get better results. You see, measuring the result is essential to ABA. That is what really guides the whole process. Now, because of the measure the result aspect of ABA, we know that ABA underlies best practices for supporting students with ASD and other diverse needs. Something is considered best practice when it has been researched and shown to be effective in achieving desired results. Because ABA is considered best practice, educators, school personnel, and parents, among others, are increasingly expected to know what it is and how it works. Now, I'm going to tell you that you don't need to be an expert to apply the principles of ABA. But if you have some understanding, that makes implementing ABA-based interventions easier. And when you know how the principles work, you can then use them to create meaningful learning opportunities for students that contribute to their quality of life in the short and long term. The science of ABA has been around for decades. Many people have heard of it, but they don't always understand how it relates to their everyday lives, or they assume it doesn't apply to them at all. Now, these assumptions are often based on the association between ABA and ASD and other developmental disabilities. And there's a great deal of evidence to show ABA is effective for teaching individuals with ASD and other diverse needs. But the field is so much broader than that. In fact, ABA has been demonstrated to be effective in fields such as education, business, and sports, just to name a few. Let's look at some examples from the published research. In this first example I want to tell you about, coming from the field of education, a group of fourth graders were given two different tasks. They were given some easy math worksheets and some difficult math worksheets. The researchers wanted to know if the students would complete more of the task if they were rewarded for accuracy or for time on task. Now, interestingly, the results showed that students preferred accuracy-based rewards for easy tasks and time-based rewards for difficult material. The researchers concluded that students prefer different types of rewards for work completion depending on their skill level. And then they went on to suggest that matching rewards to student proficiency may increase motivation, and that changing rewards as students' skills improve may promote continued practice. And there are many, many more examples of how ABA has and can be applied in education. There are studies demonstrating effective intervention for reading, math, spelling, behavior management, functional and behavior and social skills, and on and on. So let's turn our attention to an example from the business world. I want you to picture the work commercial delivery drivers do. They get in and out of their vehicles frequently and may not always buckle their seatbelt between stops. Not wearing seatbelts is a safety issue, so businesses encourage their employees to buckle up. In one study looking at ways to encourage seatbelt use, a device was added to the accelerator pedal that prevented drivers from going over a preset speed if their seatbelt wasn't buckled. Before the device was installed, drivers were only buckling their seatbelts between 61 and 69% of the time. When the device was installed, seatbelt buckling instantly went to 100% compliance. And in fact, all of the drivers were buckling their seatbelts in less than 25 seconds. Now, because of this immediate improvement, the researchers decided to look at the effect of the device over a longer time and with more drivers. They really wanted to compare their results to other systems that were designed to improve seatbelt use among commercial drivers. This is ABA. Behavior was measured, before and after intervention, and I'm sure we'd all agree that safety is a socially significant issue. Again, this is just a single example. There are thousands more studies demonstrating ABA to be effective in the world of business, especially in areas such as staff training, workplace safety, and performance management. In fact, there's a specialized area of ABA known as organizational behavioral management that focuses on behavior in the workplace and looks for solutions to workplace performance issues. In a sports-related example, from the world of American football, there was a study conducted where the skill that needed improving was wide receiving. The intervention was publicly posting goals and feedback, meaning the players set goals and then posted their goals and coach feedback for all the team to see. With this intervention, the 3 players in the study improved performance of their wide receiving skills from 70 to 80% accuracy before intervention to 90 to 100% accuracy during practice, and most importantly, to 100% accuracy during games. The researchers concluded that publicly posting goals and feedback likely impacted the players' motivation to improve their performance. They also concluded that this might be an effective way to improve performance in sport in general. Now again, this is just a single example, but ABA has been shown to be effective in sport to teach and reinforce skills used in training and competition, diet and exercise, and proper body form. Now, just as important as all those examples, ABA applies in everyday life. ABA applies to the child learning to tie his shoes and the teenager learning to drive. These complex skills can be broken down and then taught one step at a time. The principles of learning also apply to the child who cries every time her mother is on the phone, and to the boy who has a temper tantrum in the grocery store checkout line when he doesn't get the candy he asks for. Crying is sure to get mom's attention, and if a tantrum results in getting the candy on one occasion, it's really likely to happen again. The students who are praised for cleaning up tables in the cafeteria are more likely to do so compared to those whose cleaning up behavior is never acknowledged. The principles of ABA are also at work when children are encouraged by their parents' smiles, praise, excitement, and celebration to repeat their first words or use the potty again. Maybe you can think of some examples where ABA applies in your own life. So we're going to pause briefly for you to check your understanding of what we've talked about so far. I'd like for you to select the best option to complete the statement. The underlying principles of applied behavior analysis apply to 1, individuals with autism spectrum disorder and other diverse needs, 2, individuals in sport, or 3, to all people. So the answer is 3. ABA is the science of learning, and it applies to all people. Now, perhaps you've noticed that I've referred to ABA as a science many times. This is because ABA meets the definition of a science, which is a systematic approach to seeking and organizing knowledge about the natural world. ABA is a natural science. It has its own concepts, research methods, and principles that distinguish it from other sciences. ABA allows us to describe, make predictions about, and demonstrate how changing environmental variables reliably produces predictable change in behavior. There are thousands of studies with all kinds of people that have demonstrated how ABA can be used to teach skills and increase positive behavior, to reduce problem behavior, and help people use their skills in new situations. This scientific evidence provides the framework for ABA-based interventions that produce positive results in all kinds of circumstances. So let's turn our attention to the principles of learning. The principles of learning describe how behavior affects and is affected by what happens in the environment. Specifically, the principles look at events of interest that occur closely in time, before and after a specified behavior occurs. The events that occur closely in time before the specified behavior are known as antecedents. Events that occur closely in time after the specified behavior are known as consequences. Remember the terms antecedent and consequence, so we're going to look at those in a little more detail a little later on. For now, it's important to know that ABA methods involve observation of an individual as he or she interacts with various aspects of the environment, namely the antecedents and consequences. In general, behavior is measured directly and repeatedly in the presence of specified antecedents and consequences. The results are graphed, and the graph is analyzed to see if the behavior has changed, and if that change can be attributed to the specified antecedent or consequence. If we think back to the example of the delivery drivers, here we have a clear demonstration of the methods of ABA. Seatbelt buckling behavior was measured before and after installation of the device that limited speed when the seatbelt was not buckled. There was a clear change. Seatbelt buckling went from 61 to 69% to 100% when the device was installed. The researchers could have looked at what happened to seatbelt use after the device was removed, or they could have rechecked use after a few months to see if the rate remained at 100%. See, there's lots of ways to manipulate variables to study the effects on behavior. So now, I'd like to look at a couple of examples where measuring environmental variables led to some important changes in the behavior of children. The first study I'd like to tell you about involved 4 children with intellectual disabilities. The researchers determined that these children were engaging in aggression whenever other people tried to interact with them. At the beginning, the children engaged in aggression in 87 to 100% of the intervals where data was recorded. And yet, there was no aggression when the researchers and their helpers were in the same room, but only engaged with each other. By repeating the conditions, the researchers determined that the children were engaging in aggression to escape social interaction with others. Now, because ABA focuses on positive outcomes, the researchers then went on to devise an intervention plan that was intended to decrease that aggressive behavior and increase socially appropriate behavior. And I'm happy to tell you that the intervention was successful for all the children. And then it makes it a good example of how ABA can improve an individual's quality of life. Because I'm sure we can all agree that interacting with others in socially appropriate ways likely increased these children's opportunities for learning and participating in the community. In another example, researchers increased pretend play of 2-year-olds with disabilities in an inclusive classroom. Pretend play is an important skill for toddlers, and not being able to engage in pretend play likely meant that these children were missing out on important learning opportunities at daycare. The researchers designed an intervention that included choice of play centers, prompting, and praise. And the intervention was actually implemented by the daycare staff during free play periods throughout the day. When it was free play time, the staff provided the children with a choice by showing pictures and asking which center the child wanted to play in. When the child made a choice, he or she was then escorted to that center. If the child didn't initiate play within 10 seconds, they were guided to a toy. If they didn't initiate play with that toy, they were assisted to complete a pretend play action with it. All the pretend play actions, independent or prompted, were immediately followed by praise. If children left the center before the free play period ended, the staff would initiate another choice and repeat the cycle. Before intervention, these children engaged in less than 1 pretend play action per minute. After intervention, 4 of the 5 children had increased their rate of independent pretend play to rates near those of their typically developing peers. And the researchers continue to look at options for helping the 5th child increase his pretend play as well. This is a seemingly small change that likely had a big impact on these children's opportunities to engage and learn with peers. So we're going to pause again to check your understanding. What option best completes this statement? ABA is the science of learning, 2, brain development, or 3, autism intervention. ABA is the science of learning. Its focus is how we learn skills and behavior from birth onward. Now, we know ABA represents best practice for many learners because it provides procedures to assess needs, select meaningful goals and intervention, and to monitor progress. ABA is not a bag of tricks that can be used as a one-size-fits-all approach. Interventions must be individualized according to each learner's strengths and needs. It must consider the skills that are important to the person's daily life, and it has to use data to demonstrate effectiveness. In the examples we've discussed thus far, decreasing aggression, increasing pretend play, improving sport skills, wearing a seatbelt. We assume that needs were assessed and meaningful goals were set. The changes that occurred are believed to have improved the individual's lives. In all cases, baseline data was collected, an intervention was put in place, and progress was measured. This is ABA. Now, there are many teaching strategies based on the principles of learning that can be used to support meaningful behavior change. Some examples are named here on the slide. For example, shaping, discrete trial instruction, chaining, and so on. These different techniques have one thing in common. They all rely on what is known about behavior and how the environment influences behavior to promote learning and lasting behavior change. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about these techniques in this presentation, but I will talk a little bit more about what they have in common. So what the various techniques named on the previous slide and others have in common is the principles of learning. And the principles of learning help explain how environmental variables influence behavior. This is easiest to explain in terms of the relationship between the antecedent, behavior, and consequence, or the ABCs. So in this diagram on the slide, A represents antecedent. Remember, the antecedent is what happens immediately before the behavior occurs. Antecedents don't cause behavior, but they do set up the conditions for behavior to occur. And an antecedent can be anything that exists or occurs in the environment. It can be a verbal instruction, it can be the presence of a person, toy, or object, or it can be something else like light or sound. B represents the behavior being measured, and C stands for the consequence, or what immediately happens following the behavior. It's really the consequences that determine if behavior will increase or decrease in the future. And consequences are classified as reinforcing or punishing. Reinforcing consequences maintain or increase behavior, while punishing consequences reduce or eliminate behavior. It's important to note here that the effect of the consequence on behavior is what determines if it's reinforcing or punishing, not the perceived pleasantness of the consequence. So for example, a teacher might consider a reprimand to be a punishing consequence for a student's interrupting behavior, but the behavior continues, or maybe it even increases over time despite these ongoing reprimands. In this case, the reprimands are actually a reinforcing consequence. They're not a punishing consequence. We know they're reinforcing because the behavior is not reducing and it's not going away. Let's look at another simple example. A mother asks her daughter to turn off the TV because it's time for bed. Mom's request is the antecedent, time for bed. Turning off the TV is the behavior of interest. The mother thanks her daughter and gives her a hug. This is the consequence. To know if this consequence was reinforcing or punishing, the mother would have to repeat the sequence again, asking her daughter to turn off the TV. If the daughter turns it off, it means that the consequence, thanking her and giving her a hug, is reinforcing because it maintains the behavior. Understanding the ABCs of behavior helps us understand why behavior occurs, how different consequences could impact whether the behavior will happen again in the future, and how we can teach new behavior and skills. So most ABA interventions, whether they're designed to increase or decrease behavior, are based on carefully controlling the antecedent and/or applying reinforcing consequences to achieve goals. Controlling antecedents simply means that we arrange the environment to improve conditions for learning. Antecedent intervention varies depending on the learner, but it usually involves things like using the learner's interests and preferences to influence motivation, offering choice, mixing easy or mastered tasks with new or more difficult tasks, and adding variety to tasks and routines. For example, I once worked with a teacher who had a student who engaged in challenging behavior whenever he was presented with reading tasks. The teacher and I devised two antecedent interventions, choice, and we incorporated the learner's interests in all of the different tasks that he did. To start, reading materials related to his interests were selected by the teacher, and then he was offered a choice of which materials to use during instruction. Because the learner had a strong interest in spiders, the teacher also used spider-shaped cards and other materials when preparing reading tasks. These examples show how the teacher arranged the environment to influence the student's motivation, resulting in an elimination of the challenging behavior. Now, the second way to apply the ABCs of learning is to provide a reinforcing consequence following desired behavior. For example, for the student who had an interest in spiders, we used a token system, and he earned a token each time he completed a reading task. And then the tokens were later traded for preferred items. Reinforcing consequences express the idea that people learn behaviors that work, and that they learn from their experience. The use of reinforcing consequences is an evidence-based intervention. Reinforcing consequences can be used to change behavior for all learners, regardless of their cognitive level or communicative abilities. Now, this is one of the main strategies for teaching new behavior and skills, strengthening learned behavior, speeding up the learning process, and providing motivation for learning. When behavior is followed by something valued by the individual, a reward, the person is more likely to repeat that behavior in the future. When a reinforcing consequence follows the behavior repeatedly over time, the behavior is changed in a meaningful way. Reinforcing consequences vary from person to person and from day to day, and they do not have to be perceived as pleasant by others to change behavior. We might think of things like praise, food, and tangibles as rewards, but things not usually considered pleasant can also increase behavior. For example, reprimands. And sometimes even neutral things like pipe cleaners can be a reinforcing consequence for some learners. Let's look at some examples. So in these examples, I'm just looking at the behavior and the consequence that follows it. In my first example, Mark completes his homework without being asked, and Dad provides lots of praise. Mark completes his homework without being asked more often. Therefore, praise is a reinforcing consequence. Mandy completes a list of chores each week and receives $1 after each chore is done. Getting paid for completing her chores increases the number of things she does independently. Money and the things that can be acquired with that money are reinforcing for the behaviors associated with completing the chores. Think about the example of Sammy, who promptly gets ready for bed when asked, and Mom reads aloud before turning out the light. Mom notices that Sammy gets ready for bed promptly more often. Reading aloud is a reinforcing consequence. A teacher sets up a system in the classroom where students earn a marble for a jar whenever the whole class completes an assignment as directed. When the jar is full, there is a reward for everyone. The teacher notices over time that more and more students are completing assignments as directed. The marbles and the backup rewards associated with filling the jar are reinforcing consequences for the academic behavior. A group of students who volunteer to clean up the playground get hot cocoa and cookies afterward, and the rate of volunteering for playground cleanup increases. So as you can see, reinforcing consequences can be used to increase all kinds of behaviors. Before we go any further, I want to talk about some objections to the use of reinforcing consequences. Often these objections come from misinformation or lack of understanding. Some people believe that reinforcing consequences aren't natural or will cause changes in the learner's personality. In fact, reinforcing consequences happen continuously in everyday situations and interactions. For example, entertaining reading material provides the skilled reader the natural consequence of reading. Providing someone with a desired object is the natural consequence after he or she has asked for that object by name. Now, these are examples of natural consequences. For some individuals, natural consequences do not always act as reinforcers or important behaviors, and it can be necessary to use contrived reinforcers to motivate them to do things they wouldn't otherwise do. The contrived reinforcers help get the new behavior started. Once the behavior is established, it's possible to gradually shift from the contrived to more natural reinforcers. Using the example of reading again, it may be necessary to motivate a learner to read until he or she has sufficient reading skills to read for pleasure. Another misconception is that reinforcing consequences decrease a learner's motivation. In fact, research in this area has proven otherwise. When appropriate reinforcing consequences are provided, contingent on a specific behavior, there are positive effects on behavior and motivation. Gradually fading from contrived to naturally occurring reinforcers helps ensure the learner doesn't become dependent on contrived reinforcers to engage in the behavior or skill. Some people believe that the use of reinforcing consequences is the same as bribery. Bribery is often used to promote dishonest, illegal, or immoral behavior, primarily for the benefit of the person giving the bribe. For example, if someone was to say, "If you keep my secret, I'll give you money," this would be a bribe. Bribes are offered before behavior, but reinforcement occurs afterward. When a learner is bribed, he or she often learns to comply only when the bribe is offered. Reinforcement, on the other hand, is used to promote positive behavior and makes learning more enjoyable. It benefits the learner by helping him or her develop the skills that are supported by family and the community. And another objection to the use of reinforcing consequences is that some people feel it treats some learners differently than others. I would say that all learners should be treated as unique individuals with different strengths, challenges, and needs. Some learners may need help with reading and writing, but are good at arts and sports. Some learners may need support from an educational assistant during certain parts of the day, and some may need accommodations to meet their individual learning needs. Treating individuals differently based on their needs and strengths is not unfair. Time to check your understanding again. What option best completes this statement? For an intervention to be considered to be applied behavior analysis, it must include 1, an antecedent and consequence, 2, assessment, meaningful goals, and progress monitoring, or 3, a reinforcing consequence. The answer is 2. Sometimes interventions are based on the principles of ABA, but if they do not include assessment, meaningful goals aimed at improving the individual's quality of life, and progress monitoring, the intervention is not ABA. So now I'd like to talk about a few misconceptions about ABA. Unfortunately, these misconceptions may lead some people to view ABA in a negative way. A common misconception is that ABA intervention only takes place in clinics, homes, or segregated therapy settings. This does sometimes happen, but this approach to intervention makes it more difficult for learners to use their skills in natural settings. If skills are taught in isolation, they are unlikely to generalize to everyday routines and activities, meaning that the skills won't be used when and where they're needed. ABA can and should take place in settings where students interact with others. It doesn't mean we simply place the individual in settings with typically developing peers and expect them to learn needed skills. The skills still need to be taught. ABA interventions rely on systematic planning, individualized learning objectives, and ongoing progress monitoring to ensure the goals are appropriate and that students learn and generalize skills in the settings where they are expected to use them. A more worrisome misconception is the idea that ABA is a quick fix for problem behavior. Sometimes a well-planned intervention can result in rapid improvement, but the speed with which an intervention brings about the desired change can vary depending on the learner's age, their needs and strengths, and other factors in the environment that may or may not be possible to control, such as staffing or the availability of resources. Sometimes the misinformed may abandon effective intervention too quickly or dismiss potentially effective interventions without ever trying them, with the hope of finding something that will fix a problem behavior quicker. Noticeable improvement may take time, especially when the learner is developing new skills that will help him or her function more successfully in everyday situations. Now, another misconception is that ABA and intensive behavioral intervention, which is also known as IBI, are the same thing. Some people use these terms interchangeably, but ABA and IBI are not the same thing. ABA is based on the principles of learning that apply to everyone. IBI is based on the principles of ABA, but it doesn't apply to everyone. IBI is intended for preschool children with ASD. It usually involves 15 to 20 or even more hours per week of intervention. It's individualized to each child's needs, and it's intended to help children with ASD increase their rate of learning so that they might catch up to their typically developing peers. A good way to sum it up is that IBI is ABA, but ABA is not IBI. Unfortunately, there is also a misconception among some that ABA excludes other professional service providers from intervention. I can't state strongly enough, ABA intervention does not exclude other professional services. In many cases, learners with ASD require the services of multiple professionals, such as occupational therapists, physical therapists, or speech-language pathologists. And research-supported interventions from different theoretical perspectives can enhance the effectiveness of treatment. However, it does require collaboration and planning on the part of all the professionals involved to ensure that intervention has clear goals, appropriate methods, and measures outcomes. Which statement is true? 1, ABA intervention can and should take place in settings where the individual interacts with others. 2, an ABA intervention program does not include other services, such as speech-language therapy. Or 3, ABA and IBI refer to the same thing. The answer is 1. If we want learners to use their skills effectively, it is best to teach them in the environments where they are needed and where they can be supported by others. The job titles of Board Certified Behavior Analyst or Behavior Analyst are not recognized by many. And while no degree or certification is required to use behavioral principles in everyday life, applied behavior analysis is a profession with a well-established credentialing program that includes a master's degree, supervised experience in the application of the science of ABA, and a professional exam. Board Certified Behavior Analysts, or BCBAs as they're also known, have many different job titles and are employed in a variety of settings, including healthcare, education, and social assistance, where they teach, provide counseling, manage facilities, clinics, and organizations, and train staff. No matter the title or setting, behavior analysts provide services that include treatment planning, data collection, therapy, case management, and training with the goal of developing programs and interventions that apply the principles of learning to address a wide variety of social and human issues. There's also several professional organizations dedicated to the philosophy, science, application, and teaching of behavior analysis. These organizations help promote dissemination of the science. They provide continuing education opportunities for behavior analysis practitioners. They publish scholarly journals related to ABA, and they promote specialized areas such as autism, behavioral medicine, verbal behavior, health, sport, and fitness, to name a few. Now, I've shared a lot of information about ABA in a very short period of time. What I hope that you take away from all of this is that ABA is the science of learning, and it applies to everyone. ABA practitioners focus on socially significant behavior and improving an individual's quality of life. Numerous scientific studies have shown that various ABA techniques are effective and, as such, form the basis of best practice for autism intervention. You may not be an expert in ABA, but understanding the principles of learning can help you apply them in everyday life and develop and implement meaningful learning opportunities for a variety of learners. So before we close this afternoon, take the opportunity to ask some questions if there are any, and Sherry's been collecting those, so we'll hear from Sherry.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for sharing some of the research with us today. You've given us a lot to think about. The examples that you provided definitely show us how diverse ABA can be and how it's helping to help people learn socially important behaviors. So far, there hasn't been any questions. We can just take a moment. If anyone has any, they can send it in the chat box. We're getting a number of comments about people who enjoyed the workshop, the webinar with you today, Catherine. It doesn't look like there's any questions coming in, but there may be some that you have in the future. And so we here at Autism Learning Partnership would really like to thank everyone for joining us today and for your interest. This is our very first webinar, and we will be sending you a survey by email, and we'd like to get your feedback on that. We do have an email that if later you have questions or want more information from us, then we'd be happy to get that from you. So thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you, Catherine.